Greetings and welcome. Thanks for tuning in. I'm Daniel Lazar, and it is my humble privilege and my pleasure to do my little part here to contribute to the marketplace of ideas and to support you in your pursuit of studying history. Today's talk is called Opposing Perspectives, and it asks the question, was the New Deal revolutionary? And in fact, it walks you through two sides. The first, arguing that the New Deal is in fact tantamount to a revolution, and the other arguing that the New Deal was indeed not revolutionary at all, or perhaps not revolutionary enough. And the tone and the content of this debate, I think, are a little bit different than a lot of the talks I'm giving on this station. This talk does not seek to explain the New Deal or analyze it per se, but rather to look at the New Deal through a very particular lens of whether the New Deal was revolutionary or not. And it's a debate that matters a lot, and I'll talk about why. I'm going to put myself right between these fellas, although I'm not entirely sure I belong there. But there I am. This debate over whether or not the New Deal was revolutionary marks a fundamental divide within the American left. It is a divide that's well represented between, on your left, though perhaps not appropriately, Carl Degler, the eminent Stanford historian, lived a long and healthy life, was a true titan of American liberal history. And in an essay that he wrote called The Third American Revolution, which was published in a book called Out of Our Past, The Forces That Shaped Modern America, published in 1959, Carl Degler makes the argument that the New Deal, taken in its entirety, was indeed and in fact revolutionary. Yeah. And I'll walk you through his arguments, which are compelling and convincing, and equally compelling and convincing, I would say, are the arguments of Howard Zinn, the Boston University historian who began his career at Spelman, who in his foreword to a collection of essays that he edited entitled New Deal Thought, argues that the New Deal was not revolutionary at all, or at least not revolutionary enough for him. So this is then not a left-right debate, but a debate within the American left, and in fact, a defining, maybe even the defining debate within the American liberal historical canon, at least for the 20th century. And so I guess you have to wonder, well, why should I pay attention to that? Why does that matter? What do I care what two eggheads from highly reputed universities have to say about the New Deal? Why does it matter, in short? Well, let me do my part to try to answer the why does it matter question with this why does it matter slide that I have created. How about that? All right. So why does this intellectual debate between two eminent left-wing historians matter to you? Well, first and foremost, it matters because it's interesting. It's a fascinating angle on this turning point in American history. And there's no doubt here that the New Deal does mark a turning point. The question is whether it was a substantial turning point, a revolution, whether the New Deal marks an entirely new path for America, or whether the New Deal marks changes which are important, which may or may not be good, but it's hardly a revolution. And let me kind of seize this moment to make something clear. This is not a debate about whether the New Deal should have happened. This is not a debate necessarily about whether the New Deal should have been more revolutionary. It's a debate over whether it was revolutionary. And this debate matters because this debate represents a fundamental divide within the left. To this very day, you have what is effectively an argument between New Deal liberals, center-left Democrats, center-left intellectuals, and more radical, progressive, social democratic oriented politicians, intellectuals, and voters. To put that another way, the argument over whether or not the New Deal was revolutionary is sort of a proxy for where we stand on the left. Those who argue that the New Deal was tantamount to a revolution tend to be on the center left. Those who believe that the New Deal was not revolutionary, that it didn't go far enough, tend to be on the farther left, in the more progressive, social democratic, socialist, or even communist parts of the American left. And this division among and between Americans created this space for the American right to rise, right? So in other words, while the left was infighting, throughout much of the late 60s and 70s, the right congealed around the ideas most well articulated probably by Ronald Reagan, who said famously in some circles and infamously in others that the 9 most dangerous words in the English language are, "I'm from the government and I'm here to help." And so this debate matters because the right was convinced that the New Deal was revolutionary and that it was a revolution in the wrong direction. And the Reagan Revolution, the so-called Reagan Revolution, was the counter argument. Reagan offered a counter narrative to New Deal politics, and New Deal politics really explain 2 generations of American politics, basically from 1933 until 1980. American politics, at least, were dominated by New Deal thought. Right? So this debate matters because it puts into context arguably the counter-revolution. So if we're having this debate about whether the New Deal was a revolution, then we will later have a debate about the degree to which the Reagan years mark a revolution in American political history. This debate also matters because if the New Deal was in fact revolutionary, and if Americans don't see themselves as revolutionary types, if America is at its heart, for better and for worse, a more conservative or traditional country with a more conservative traditional political culture, then the New Deal in its revolutionary nature marks an unwelcome departure from the American political tradition. Yeah. And if the New Deal, in fact, wasn't revolutionary, and again, this isn't a question of whether the New Deal was good or bad, it's a question of whether it was revolutionary. And if the New Deal, in fact, was not revolutionary, then one might be in a better position to argue that America needs some sort of a revolution to correct its original sins and to share its bounty with more people. Moreover, if the New Deal was not revolutionary, then there was no need for a so-called Reagan Revolution, right? If the Reagan Revolution was the counter-revolution to a revolution that did not exist, then the Reagan Revolution was unwelcome. So I think you're getting the point, right? This debate is, in its origins, on some level at least, an academic debate. But it's an academic debate which, if you will, has trickled down throughout American political culture. So it's really substantial. I hope I've sold you on it. And so what I'm going to do now, at least what I'm going to try to do after this, is to walk you through Degler's argument. So the pro argument, the New Deal was revolutionary. And then we'll pause and we'll go into Zinn's argument. I want to remind you, of course, that this lecture will be available to you at daniellazar.com. So enjoy that there. Okay, so Degler's thesis is that the New Deal fomented and I'm quoting here, a new conception of the good society that fundamentally altered America's perception of the role of government. So the New Deal was revolutionary because it fundamentally altered what the American people expect from their government. All right? And there's a couple of key points. I've restructured parts of his argument for the purposes of this lecture. I've done that with Zinn too. I'm not entirely parroting them, but it's their work and their ideas that are inspiring both the tone and the content of this lecture. So, Degler argues that the New Deal was revolutionary because in his mind, the New Deal marks the end of laissez-faire economics in America. That the days of cowboy capitalism were destroyed by the New Deal, and that capitalism fundamentally was compromised by the New Deal. That the New Deal revolutionized the function of legitimate government. And one of the first examples he draws on to explain how laissez-faire ended is the Securities and Exchange Commission. The SEC demanded then and demands now corporate accountability, and it created a permanent structure for the government's monitoring of the financial industries. Prior to the New Deal, as you learned from the causes of the crash and as you watched throughout the Gilded Age and most of the late 19th century, American capitalism was almost entirely unregulated. This led to lots of fits and spurts. The panic of 1873, the crash of 1893 and 1907, and finally 1929. And the Securities and Exchange Commission monitors the American financial industries to ensure that the depth and the length of American depressions are not as painful for the American people. And it demands transparency and accountability. And while the SEC is imperfect, and I'm sure Degler would be perfectly willing to concede that, the SEC changes the role of government. The Agricultural Adjustment Act was revolutionary. So whereas the SEC was a revolution in the financial services, the AAA was revolutionary in terms of the farming industries. This was the populists were deemed to be radicals. The populists were deemed to be revolutionaries. And the Agricultural Adjustment Act um, did for the American farmers more than what the populists had ever begged for. Yeah. The federal government was paying farmers to let land lay fallow. The federal government was purchasing surpluses and storing farmer surpluses at no cost. The Agricultural Adjustment Act, paid farmers to kill piglets. 6 million piglets were killed, 200,000 cows, to control the supply and demand and to make it so that farmers could stay on their land. It was the Agricultural Adjustment Act was, in short, socialism for farmers, and that's revolutionary. Again, Degler's not trying to argue whether this was good or bad, although I think by and large he thinks that the end of laissez-faire as we knew it was good. He's just simply trying to argue that it was revolutionary for better and for worse. The Tennessee Valley Authority was socialism for the Tennessee Valley. It was, and these are his words, humane social planning of the socialist variety to integrate the backwards South. It wasn't just Tennessee, it was Kentucky, parts of West Virginia. That entire area was given, energy, and it basically brought the Tennessee Valley from the 18th century into the 20th century, and it did so rapidly. And that's part of the revolutionary nature of the New Deal, is how much change happened so fast. I mean, I think on some level we define revolutions by the rapidity of the change. And the TVA, the Tennessee Valley, changed so dramatically, sort of breakneck pace. The Works Progress Administration, the National Youth Administration, the Civil Works Administration, all of these jobs programs. Now, listen, perhaps it's normal and natural to those of us in the 21st century that the federal government should be a substantial employer of the American people. It is indeed the case that the federal government is the largest employer in America, employing more than 2 million people, not even including the military. But that's because of the New Deal. Never before the New Deal would the federal government seek to create the jobs programs that you've learned about in advance of this lecture. And you look at the Works Progress Administration in and of itself, my favorite of the New Deal programs. It created what Degler calls a cultural revolution. The Federal Writers Project, employing 6,000 writers, including, fellas like John Steinbeck. The Federal Music Project. 50 million Americans saw productions in the first 15 months of the Federal Music Project. The Federal Theater Project. 60 million Americans saw theater programs in 37 different states paid for by the United States government. This is tantamount to not just a cultural revolution, but a revolution in the function of American government. This is like Sweden, coming to you from Berlin. This is why a lot of American artists like coming to, northern, northwestern Europe, because you have this socialist state sanctioned support of the arts. That's what America became in the 1930s. And the legacy of that is profound. Not culturally, of course, the legacy is profound, but also politically. Yeah. In 1937, Fortune magazine claimed that a cultural revolution was happening in America. A British writer at the time argued, and I'm quoting here, that art in America is being given its chance. There has been nothing like it since before the Reformation. I don't know how true that is, but there's certainly some truth to it. Yeah. And you add all of these up, the SEC, the AAA, the TVA, all of these jobs programs, you add it all up, the component parts are tantamount to a revolution in the legitimate functioning of the government. If and when depressions happen, the American people expect, nay, they demand that the federal government save them. This lecture is being recorded in the midst of a pandemic. The American people are getting a check cut to them. Not just American businesses, some of which are getting millions of dollars, but the American people. I just got a $1,200 check in the mail. That's unimaginable. And the panic of 1907 or the crash of 1893, the New Deal made Americans expect that the federal government will take care of them if and when the economy goes sideways. It is the end of laissez-faire as we know it, and thus it's a revolution, argues Carl Degler. It was a political revolution also because of the tone of Franklin Delano Roosevelt and the people to whom he communicated. In his fireside chats with all of the kind of muted charisma that FDR had, Roosevelt spoke to the American people in ways that no president ever had before. And he made them promises, many of which he delivered on. Now, it is true that the radio was a rather new invention, and perhaps someone would have, come around to speak to the American people in their homes via the radio. But it was Roosevelt who did it. And that role of the president as communicator in chief, as someone who is welcomed into the homes of most Americans, at least until recently, marks a revolution in politics. It is sort of a populist. The notion that the president has something to offer everyone, that he can speak to the entire nation, and that he speaks to them in language that they can comprehend, despite the ways in which FDR was, sort of a silver spoon fella. He had seen enough hardship in his life that somehow or another he was able to communicate to everyone. And that is a theme in American history, right? We've seen populists, the likes of Andrew Jackson or William Jennings Bryan. Even Teddy Roosevelt had some populist tendencies, but FDR institutionalized populism. And that is revolutionary in the tone of American politics. And with that populist tone, he was able to speak to the American working class in ways that they've never been spoken to before. And for that reason, the American working class became loyal Democrats, arguably too loyal, until the so-called Reagan Revolution of the 80s. Yeah. But it's also a political revolution because African Americans found great favor in FDR. And while FDR's record on race is hardly perfect, and it demands space for criticism that Degler is open to, and that Zinn sort of takes by the horns. Frederick Douglass said on a number of occasions that the Republican Party, the party of Abraham Lincoln, the great emancipator, that the Republican Party is the ship, all else is the sea. Today, about 85% of African Americans loyally vote Democratic. What was the change? The New Deal. What the war for union did for Republicans, the Civil War, in other words, did for Republicans, the Great Depression achieved for Democrats. It made extremely loyal voters out of the African American population. FDR successfully courted Black votes. In 1932, FDR got 23% of the Black vote, and in 1936, in the next election, he got just shy of 50%. And that matters. Now, Zinn will point out, just to foreshadow part of his argument, that the New Deal programs were segregated, that FDR didn't focus as much on race, that he was afraid of the Southern Democrats, who were not exactly friends of the African American communities that they represented. And it is indeed the case that FDR was, as Degler describes it, hamstrung by the Southern Democratic contingent. But the CCC and the NYA did employ African Americans despite segregation. That FDR had at his side what he called his Black Brains Trust. He had, the Brains Trust, which conceived of these New Deal programs. He had a Black Brains Trust also. He had African Americans, including Bob Weaver, in prominent positions in his cabinet. And what Degler argues, and there's something compelling about it, and you can decide how compelling it is that while FDR did not combat segregation in ways that would have made him more heroic to more of us, he changed the tone of the conversation around race in America. And while he could have, and I'll say it, probably should have, listened to his wife Eleanor and been more progressive in sharing the blessings of American wealth and liberty with African Americans, the politics of the time, he feared, made that impossible. To be more blunt about it, in case you're not reading between the lines or in case I'm not expressing this as perfectly as I'd like to, FDR did not think that he could get many of his New Deal programs passed through Congress if he was too progressive on the race question. He wouldn't get the votes. John F. Kennedy, who is sort of the heir to the throne of FDR, faced that same problem. And he himself was slow to act on race because he didn't think he could get through his robust New Frontier initiatives with Southern Democrats stymieing him along the way. And Lyndon Johnson, for his part, also in the New Deal tradition, tried to walk that tightrope, as we'll see. And LBJ wagered his political career on that and on Vietnam, of course, and lost. Lyndon Johnson said that if the 1964 Civil Rights Act passed, with the most robust civil rights legislation since the Civil War era, that the Democratic Party would lose the South for a generation to come. And he was dead right. So 30 years earlier, FDR did not end segregation in America. He was not a radical as it pertained to race, but he moved the country in the right direction. He changed the tone of the discussion. And for that reason, Degler gives FDR credit for creating a political revolution in America. Yeah. Perhaps a stronger point for Degler here is this notion that the New Deal was tantamount to a revolution in labor. And this is I think this is the core of his argument. As perhaps you learned in the 1920s American labor was hamstrung, to say the least. You had the first Red Scare coming out of World War I. A. Mitchell Palmer had his way with the American labor movement. Labor organization membership went down from 5 million in 1920 to 3 million workers by 1929. This is both because of the Palmer raids and the anti-union, anti-commie tenor of the 1920s, but it's also because the American economic boom of the 1920s didn't demand union membership in the ways that perhaps it had before. In other words, the 20s were roaring, as they say, right? The economy was roaring, so labor unions didn't have to roar in the same way. But the Great Depression created a class consciousness among American working men for the first time sufficient enough to permit large-scale unionization. And we went from 3 million union workers in 1929 to 4 million in 1935 and 8 million in 1940. So virtually a threefold increase in union membership during the New Deal era. And it's not just that the unions were forming and that people were joining them. It's that FDR's government, the New Deal government, supported those unions in ways that were not just unprecedented in American history, but were, according to Degler, revolutionary in American history. Yeah. Degler says, and again, I'm quoting here, that the National Labor Relations Act, otherwise known as the Wagner Act, the Wagner Act, was, quote, the single most revolutionary measure in American labor history. It was a revolution in the government attitude towards labor. Big labor now took its place along big business and big government to create a triumvirate of power. So we have a triangle, yeah, and you have government, business, and labor, and you should see it as an equilateral triangle. Yeah, there were always unions, but government and business had all the power, had most of the power. I don't want to be too hyperbolic. They had most of the power. Now unions actually sat at the table. The New Deal created space for unions to sit at the table. And while I wouldn't argue they had an equal degree of power by comparison to government and business, they had a much more equal share of the power than they ever had in American history. And that, of course, becomes very important when these unions were called upon to work assiduously to get America prepared for the war effort as World War II was looming. This National Labor Relations Act created the National Labor Relations Board, which supervised union elections. And by the federal government coming in to supervise union elections, that legitimized the unions. It more than legitimized unions, it demonstrated the federal government's belief that unions were desirable. This is the first time in American history that unions are seen as desirable. Not only are unions not foreign, yeah, not only are they not scary, they're actually desirable. The notion that employers have to recognize a union once it's formed and that the federal government will legally bind employers to a majority union vote marks a revolution in American labor history and thus in American politics more broadly. The Wages and Hours Act of 1938 created a minimum wage of 40 cents an hour, 44 hours a week, like a legitimate work week, 44 hours a week. Now, it only could legally apply to workers who were engaged in processes that had to do with interstate trade, right? The federal government did not, arguably does not, have the legal authority to regulate hours and wages within states, which is to say, like, intrastate trade is not the prerogative of the federal government, but within the legal parameters that FDR had, he went some ways to regulating hours and wages, and he effectively abolished child labor, which was the scourge of America for a long time. Yeah. So as we start to kind of wrap up Degler's argument, start kind of reflecting on the degree to which you find it compelling. Degler argues, perhaps convincingly, again, up to you, that the progressive era was reformist, but the New Deal was, in fact, revolutionary. It was revolutionary in its willingness and ability to be flexible and to experiment. It created among the American people a belief that they should be guaranteed a certain quality of life, and the government would guarantee that, the federal government. And in that way, some of the cowboy capitalism, the so-called spirit of individualism in America was not eliminated. Americans remained very individualistic. They remained very ruggedly so. But it was tamed. The American spirit of individualism, that cowboy capitalism, had some boundaries. It had some limits. And it had some limits because the New Deal aimed to be a humanitarian program to protect the most vulnerable members of society against some of the harsh sides of capitalism. I didn't even mention, I don't think, Social Security, which is not only humane, but a permanent fixture of American political and economic life. Social Security, while imperfect and while not impervious per se, Social Security demands of the government that the most vulnerable members of society, the disabled, the elderly, can count on the federal government to take care of them. That's revolutionary. I know I think it's hard to wrap our minds around it because the American people have come to expect so much of their government, their federal government, but that was not the case in 1932. Yeah. The Social Security Act, the Securities and Exchange Commission, the Wagner Act, the FDIC, which I didn't even talk about. These are all permanent fixtures of American political life. So part of the radicalism lay in its permanence. It is irreversible. In 1932, Herbert Hoover stated, and I'm quoting here, that this election, the 1932 election, is not a mere shift. It means deciding what direction our nation will take for a century to come. And we're coming up on a century since Hoover said that. And the American people still, 90 years after the New Deal, they still continue to expect a lot out of their government. Yeah. It's a departure, argued Hoover, from the 150-year foundation that America had built up to that point. And of course, Hoover didn't win that election. FDR did. And the question is, was Hoover right? Did the New Deal mark a fundamental departure from the 150-year American political tradition that preceded FDR? Okay. So I want you to kind of pause, take stock. Yeah. What strikes you as true about Degler's point of view? What strikes you as truthy? In what ways is Degler missing the mark? Kind of support, modify, or refute Degler's key arguments. Yeah. And then I'm going to try to walk you through the arguments of the sort of celebrity historian, if you will, Howard Zinn. Howard Zinn got his career launched at the historically black University of Spelman, but he spent uh, 20, 25 years at Boston University. I say celebrity because in his twilight years, he became an object of interest of the likes of Matt Damon, who made a movie about him, quoted him in the movie Good Will Hunting, or I would say quoted him. He popularized the people's history of the United States. Zinn is very much an enemy of the political right. He is a far left revisionist historian. And when I say revisionist in this case, Zinn's seeking to revise the histories that Degler and his acolytes were spouting in the 1960s. In the context of the civil rights era, the Vietnam era, a lot of Americans were questioning the legitimacy of their government, if not the legitimacy, perhaps the humanitarian nature of their government. And in the context of the civil rights movement, the women's rights movement, the Chicano movement, the American Indian movement, the hippie movement, the yippie movement, Zinn and the revisionist historian camp to which he belongs, and in many ways that the revisionist historian camp that he was, kind of the putative leader of, they saw a kind of a rot at the core of the American political tradition, and it was a rot that the New Deal couldn't cure. All right. So if you're feeling lethargic and you're sick of hearing me talk, this would be a great time to pause and then come back and hear Zinn's argument. In either case, I'm moving forward. I'm not feeling lethargic. I'm excited. I'm ready to go. Howard Zinn. All right. Zinn's thesis, which some of you might find compelling, is that, quote, the fundamental problem remained and still remains unsolved. How to bring the blessings of immense natural wealth and staggering productive potential to every person in the land. Zinn argues, and again, you have to determine the degree to which he argues this effectively, that what FDR succeeded in doing was evading a revolution. You had real revolutions in Russia. You had real revolutions in Germany and in Italy and in Japan. The New Deal created both fascist revolutions and communist revolutions around the world. And what FDR did, and this isn't necessarily a bad thing in Zinn's mind's eye, was he evaded a revolution. He averted a revolution. He gave the American people just enough to avoid a revolution. The New Deal was about reconciliation, reconciling with the working class, reconciling with African Americans, but not a revolution. By 1939, when the New Deal ended, there were still 9 million Americans unemployed. Yeah. Income distribution was and remains today astounding, disturbing when you have, the top 5% owning 80% of America's wealth. Yeah. So there was nothing revolutionary about income redistribution. FDR offered jobs, but he didn't fundamentally change the nature of American capitalism. Urban slums in the 1930s remained despicable, and they remain despicable today. The New Deal did not tend to the poorest of the American poor in the American urban arena. The American working class were exploited, and to this day remain exploited, such as the American working class is. Social Security, it was It's permanent, it still exists, but who can live on Social Security? It's totally inadequate. You compare American Social Security to German Social Security, to Scandinavian Social Security, I mean, even to Italian Social Security and American Social Security, there's no real security in it. So, yes, FDR stabbed at the problem and he played a little bit of whack-a-mole where, you know, if African Americans were bemoaning something, he tried to resolve that problem. And if the working class, was bemoaning something, he would put a little bandage on that. But what Zinn argues is that the New Deal was seeking to put all these different bandages on what was fundamentally cancer. And band-aids don't cure cancer. Yeah. FDR was trying to cover up lesions, but there was a rot at the core of American life. And what Zinn argues is that that rot was the twin pillars of racism and capitalism. And a real revolution, according to Howard Zinn, would have ended or fundamentally changed the nature of racism and capitalism. And the New Deal doesn't do that. And the New Deal doesn't do that because FDR was not a revolutionary. He was a pragmatic politician. He was a problem solver. And again, this isn't to begrudge FDR, and it's not even to bemoan the New Deal. It doesn't seem to me that Howard Zinn is saying that the New Deal didn't do good things. The New Deal did good things, but the New Deal was limited in its scope. It didn't plan for the long term. It played whack-a-mole. And it did so within the establishment. I mean, what's a revolution, right? It's an overthrow of corporate power, maybe. Didn't have that. An overthrow of a government? We didn't have that. Revolutions fundamentally change who has power. And the New Deal didn't do that. It worked within the establishment to create short-term plans to prevent a revolution. Now, the New Deal experimented. The New Deal was experimental and it was flexible, but experimentation makes not for a revolution. Some of these experiments were great. The SEC is great. The FDC is great. But these are experiments. There's no ideological framework for them. FDR was a pragmatic problem solver for which he should be commended, but let's not commend him for starting a revolution. Yeah. What he did was to reconcile with the forces that demanded his attention, and other pragmatic politicians have done the same. Tsar Nicholas in Russia instituted a Duma. No one would say that Tsar Nicholas was a revolutionary. Bismarck sponsored social welfare measures to reconcile with the working class of Germany. Bismarck wasn't a revolutionary. I mean, he was the arch Prussian conservative. No reasonable historian would argue that Bismarck was a revolutionary. If you called Bismarck a revolutionary, he would be wicked mad. He would disagree vehemently. So FDR's pragmatic New Deal is in line with what other clever politicians who wanted to preserve their power and who wanted to preserve the power of the state, it's in line with what they have done historically. FDR's primary goal, according to Zinn, was to preserve the profit system, to preserve American capitalism, to prevent a revolution. American production is still based on private profit. American production is not based on public good. There was no socialist revolution. Yeah. the core of Zinn's argument is well expressed through this analogy that he uses of a pendulum. Yeah, a revolution is a revolution, goes all the way around. The New Deal shifted from, you know, programs for the working class, programs for the youth, programs for the elderly and Social Security, programs for the financial industries like the SEC, banking industries like the FDIC, housing. The pendulum goes back and forth. But what matters is was there a real revolution? Yeah. The width of the arcs. How far did the New Deal go? Did it go far enough that it actually becomes sort of a... And Degler argues yes, that the width of the arcs that the pendulum swung were tantamount to revolution. And Zinn says, obviously not. It solved some problems in the short term, but the New Deal didn't fundamentally solve the rot at the core of American capitalism and American racism as Howard Zinn sees it. And look, the New Deal effectively ended in 1938. You still had, at the time, 9-10 million unemployed. The worst of the Depression was over. There were many mountains to climb, but the Roosevelt administration abruptly shifted its attention to the European and Asian theaters as World War II was dawning. Now, again, it's not bad that the Roosevelt administration shifted its attention to fascists and communists. It's probably a good thing. But in so doing, it illustrates that there was no real long-term plan to solve the rot at the core of American problems. Yeah. And that there was no ideological commitment. It was pragmatic. Again, this isn't necessarily bad, but it's not revolutionary. It was piecemeal. Yeah. Got a problem with the working class. We'll try to solve that. We got a problem with the bankers need this to get back on their feet. We'll take care of that. The farmers need that to get on their feet. We're going to take care of it. African Americans need that. The American Federation of Labor needs that. The Congress of Industrial Organization needs that. And putting all these Band-Aids on these different, bleeding wounds with this fragmentation of interests and like an uprising in one sector of American life led to maybe a calming in another. And there was appeasement. There was no real theoretical commitment. What was FDR's ideology? What was he? He was a pragmatic politician. He believed in winning elections and he believed in solving problems, but he didn't do so with a theoretical commitment to, say, socialism. Yeah. He wasn't revolutionary in that way. He believed in the American political tradition. He was part of that American political tradition. He was a family member in that American political tradition. And I said this about Bismarck, but say it about FDR. You go ask FDR, would you consider yourself a revolutionary? Would you say that that your New Deal was tantamount to a revolution? You'd be like, no, not a revolutionary. Just trying to get America back on its feet where it belongs. Yeah. The Columbia University political scientist Robert McIver, who was really impressed by the early years of the New Deal, asked this question. I'm quoting, the new institutions are here, but the essential point is, who shall control them? And it was the American government that controlled these New Deal institutions. Yeah. It's not a revolution. If the same people who were in power prior to the New Deal were in power after the New Deal, what's the revolution? This is what Zinn asks, somewhat effectively, I would have to concede. And perhaps more effectively in his argumentation here, Degler, look, I've read my share of Degler's work. I respect him as an historian. He loves his children too. And he's on the right side of the race question. Carl Degler, so far as I'm aware, was not a racist. He believed in racial equality. But Zinn argues that FDR's New Deal did not create for anything like a New Deal for blacks. It was the same old deal for black people. The permanent caste structure in American society was not changed in any substantial way by the New Deal. And yeah, Carl Degler, it's true, FDR spoke in tones that were, you know, appealing to African Americans, and he was able to court their votes. But what did he deliver? There were other presidents in American history who managed to, speak with some empathy to the black plight. But de jure segregation and de facto segregation, which again, segregation by law, de jure, and de facto segregation by fact, still remained fundamental to what America stood for well after the civil rights of 1964. Which is to say, the New Deal might have talked nice to the black population, but it didn't deliver the goods. The Works Progress Administration, the Public Works Administration, the Civilian Conservation Corps, they employed blacks, but in segregated capacities. In that way, the New Deal blatantly fostered, recognized, furthered even segregation. It legitimized segregation. Eleanor Roosevelt, the president's splendid wife, who went on to have a career furthering her political agenda well into the 60s. I think she passed away in 64. She actually was a chairperson of John F. Kennedy's Commission on Gender Equality. She was always trying to press her husband to be more progressive on the civil rights front because he wasn't, and she knew it. And FDR was afraid. He was afraid to be revolutionary or to seem revolutionary on the race question. And so to call the New Deal revolutionary would force us to disregard how the status quo ante New Deal remained for black people. So much so that in 1943, A. Philip Randolph, in the heat of World War II, planned a march on Washington to protest against, segregation in the American armed forces, segregation in the American defense industries. And FDR, again, he reconciled that. He was able to, strike a deal with A. Philip Randolph and the black leadership team in the early years of the civil rights movement. He was able to reconcile it, but he didn't deliver. He didn't integrate the American armed forces, and he didn't in any substantial way integrate American defense industries. Instead, he reconciled with them. And the American people remain as they were prior to the New Deal. Americans still fetishize self-reliance and rugged individualism. The profit motive still determines the American economic life. Americans still believe, and this is a quote from FDR's Attorney General, Thurman Arnold. Right? So Arnold was Roosevelt's right-hand man in many ways. He said, Americans still believe that man works efficiently only for personal profit, that humanitarian ideals are still unworkable as the principal aim of government or business, that control of natural resources, elimination of waste, and planned distribution of goods would destroy both freedom and efficiency. So that political culture of rugged individualism, self-reliance, the profit motive, and laissez-faire remained and remain unchanged. Yeah. In his conclusion, Zinn argues that FDR shifted back and forth from spending on direct relief to spending on public works. But the significant measure, again, however, was not the swings of the pendulum, but the width of the arcs. And according to Zinn, the arcs were not wide enough to accurately call the New Deal revolutionary. So, there you have it, my friends. You have what I hope you will conclude is a fascinating debate between two eminent historians, both of whom deserve all of the praise that they earned. Zinn within the revisionist community and in pop culture. Degler earned a Pulitzer Prize and was the apple of the eye of the American Historical Association. Both bring their best arguments to the table. And again, it is a debate that's more than just academic. As we sit here in our times of crises, economic crises, I'm filming this amidst the corona crisis, what do we expect from our government? And if I may, you think about this proposed so-called Green New Deal. Where does that fit exactly in the lexicon of the American political tradition? Would a Green New Deal, such as we conceive of it, likewise be revolutionary in its tone and content? And if it is indeed revolutionary, should we be welcoming of such a revolution? And to understand the role of governments trying to get the American people out of economic crises, be they corona-induced or otherwise, to understand the nature of this Green New Deal, it is entirely essential that we step back and thoroughly investigate the historical record so that we don't have to make political decisions in a vacuum, deprived of the context that matters so much in making these decisions. And with that, my friends, I will leave you. I thank you for your attention. I hope that if you find this a fraction as interesting as I do, then we're in good shape. Please take care of yourselves, and I look forward to being with you as soon as possible. Till then, bye.